Frank Gardiner's trial actually took place behind the walls of this prison here at Darlinghurst in Sydney, which is now the National Art School. But he'll start serving out his first part of his 32 years down at Cockatoo Island. Sometime later they transfer him back here to Darlinghurst. While he's in prison he gets to do two jobs. One is to make mats, and he becomes very innovative about how these mats are made. That has impressed the government of the jail by no end. They can make a lot more of them, make more money. And they've also come up with this idea of putting a horse's head in the middle of the mat, and it's taken off Frank Gardiner's idea of his favourite horse, Darky, which he was caught with at Apis Creek. The other thing Frank Gardiner does here while he's at Darlinghurst is become a bookbinder. So those days, if you had a book that was looking a bit ratty, you bring it up here to the jailer and he would get one of the prisoners to rebind it for you. So Frank Gardiner is here, but on the outside, his sisters are his greatest supporters. And Catherine Brown is living with his elder sister, Robina Hyam, and they're trying to get visitation rights for Catherine to come and see Frank. But they're not getting a lot of ground on that subject. Then one day Henry Parkes, he's a colonial administrator, comes up, he's the boss, he comes up to the prison because the situation here inside of Darlinghurst was absolutely appalling, it was disgusting. And he meets Frank Gardiner while he's here, along with other prisoners, and he says to Frank, you know, what's your comment? He says, I don't want anything, sir, but to see my beloved Catherine Brown once a month. Henry Parkes will go back to his office and he'll write to Frank Gardiner via the sheriff's office saying, Frank, I'm not trying to punish you any more than you are being punished, but I cannot grant you your request because Catherine Brown is not your legal wife, and it'd be actually illegal for him to allow her to see him. But that doesn't stop Catherine and Robina from pressing on with their requests. And one day Robina and Catherine will actually go and see Henry Parkes at his office and put their case forward. And Henry Parkes says, all right, I give up. You're allowed one visit, Catherine, or one visit only, to go and see Frank here at Darlinghurst Prison. And about June of 1866, she comes up and sees Frank. And now Frank has got a gift for her. He's made a small Bible, small prayer book. It's a little brown one with her name engraved on gold embossed in the front, Catherine. And if you open it up, inside it, it says, presented to Catherine from your affectionate Frank, 1865. So Frank has made this a year before they meet. Now, we don't really know what goes on in that conversation, but we can assume he said to her, Catherine, I am going to be here for a very long time. So I suggest you leave Sydney and go and create a life for yourself, because that's exactly what she does. And she goes, in 1866, she goes back and moves in with Bridget at Fish River on the Lachlan, and shortly after takes up with a Dick Taylor, which is Bridget's brother-in-law, and by 1868 they're at the Thames Goldfields in New Zealand. Now, we're not really sure what goes on there either, but it got pretty desperate because Catherine Brown will take her own life by shooting herself through the mouth. Now, she doesn't die immediately, she lingers for 3 or 4 days. Now, the surgeon attending her, he puts an article in the paper in 1870, but he says that she spoke very affectionately with Frank. Such was the love between them, and she also says that she regrets doing what she did by trying to take her own life, or taking her own life. Back here in good old Sydney town, Charlotte and Achina, his younger sisters, and Robina, his elder sister, are on a campaign to get Frank on an early release. You see, in the colonial administration in those days could actually release any of these prisoners, provided they'd done most of their sentence or half of it. They could give them a pardon, which they could go free, do as you like, or they could exile them from the colony, say, see you later, you're not coming back. So they're trying to get Frank on to these early releases. And they're putting petitions up after petition, but they're gathering momentum because in 1871, 1872, they're getting into the paper. And they're also getting support from other people putting in petitions as well. And by 1874, it's dividing the community so much that Henry Parkes is forced to take it to Parliament and debate it. June of 1874, and all that work that Frank Gardiner's sisters have put in has come to fruition. In this building behind me, the New South Wales Parliament, Henry Parkes is going to debate their prerogative to let Frank Gardiner and other prisoners out of jail. Now, during that debate, some interesting facts come to light. The first thing is that the Mayor of Melbourne applied to the New South Wales administration in 1864, just after Frank Gardiner is sentenced here, to visit him. He's suspicious. He's the same man that escaped from the Pentridge Stockade in 1850, and he's right. And he tells the administration here, that's the same guy that escaped from our stockade in 1850. But the New South Wales administration doesn't do anything with that information at all. The reason being, in 1852, the colony of Victoria seceded from the colony of New South Wales. Shortly after that, gold's discovered in Victoria. A lot of gold. And so that colony is booming. The capital, Melbourne, will soon be the second largest city in the Commonwealth, next to London. So our New South Wales cousins here are feeling a bit like the poor relations. The other piece of information that comes to light is, why didn't Frank Gardiner stand trial for this escort robbery when Alex Fordyce and John Bower have been in jail for 12 years and they hang Henry Mans, and the administration says, not enough evidence. Dan Charters is the only witness and there's no one else to collaborate it. Now, Alex Fordyce and John Bower have been in jail for 12 years based on the same evidence from Dan Charters, so go work that one out. But the debate will end in Frank Gardiner's favour, and he will be released along with 10 other men, including Alex Fordyce and John Bower. Now, Fordyce and Bower said, free pardon, you can go back to your previous lives, but you, Frank Gardiner, are going to be exiled to San Francisco in America. Now, this debate and the outcome will divide this community so much that it'll cost Henry Parkes his government and his administration. But Frank Gardiner is such a celebrity, they put him on a train to Newcastle, where he'll board a steamer bound for Hong Kong, and which will ultimately take him to San Francisco in America. Frank Gardiner is going to be exiled to San Francisco, where he arrives there in the early part of 1875. And we know he gets a job in saloons there as a barman in Santa Barbara. And he must do that for quite a while, because he finishes up buying his own bar, reportedly. And then the story gets very hazy, very hard to follow. One story is that he meets an American lady, and she's a widow and very wealthy, and they leave San Francisco, go and live somewhere else, Nevada, I think. They have a couple of sons, and that's the end of Frank Gardiner. The only other part of that story that doesn't make any sense is these two sons turn up in Australia in the 1920s, passing themselves off as American geologists in Grenfell, and they go rummaging around Wedding Mountain and Wago Mountain looking for Gardiner's lost treasure. Well, that doesn't make any sense, because Gardiner would have taken everything with him to Queensland with Catherine, because he wanted to settle up a life with her. And we also know Catherine spent 2 years in Sydney, where she uses up all the money either paying for Gardiner's legal fees or trying to bribe jailers to get him out of jail. So that doesn't make any sense. The other part of the story is that Frank Gardiner gets into financial trouble with this bar, and the ever resourceful Frank Gardiner then decides to sell his story to newspapers and journalists. So he's fueling this little story back in Australia from afar. And it makes a lot of sense, because there were a lot of stories about Frank Gardiner in that period. The other story is that he meets a wealthy Scotsman that's living in San Francisco and convinces him to allow Frank Gardiner to accompany him into Australia, where they go looking for his treasure. But when Frank Gardiner gets here, he gives him the slip and disappears into Australia. And that's a kind of romantic story to think he makes it home, but I don't think very realistic. Why was he called Frank Gardiner or Frank Clark when he's born Francis Christie? Well, we can't find any real reason. There's no family connections or business associates or anything else in history that says he knew a Clark or a Gardiner. He probably just chose those names at random. Why was he called Frank Darky Gardiner, or the Darky? Well, his mother was actually Portuguese, so he had that nice swarthy skin about him. And compared to our Irish descendants of the time, he would have been quite a contrast. Frank Gardiner, we think, probably did pass away in San Francisco, but as he grew older, you must imagine he would have remembered what it was like to sit around a fire just like this with his comrades at the time, talking about their escapades of the day before and the things they were going to do in the next few weeks, maybe just planning that Urungail robbery. Or maybe he just sat around a fire like this thinking about Catherine and the life they maybe could have together one day. But that was never to be. Frank Gardiner could have easily been the folklore hero that was Ned Kelly, but Frank Gardiner was just a businessman and it got a little out of hand. But Frank Gardiner will go down in history as Frank Gardiner, King of the Road.